The lights inside the airport terminal were the kind that never seemed to turn off, casting a pale, washed-out glow over everything. It was that specific time of night where the energy in the building had shifted from the chaotic rush of the day to a heavy, dragging stillness. People were sprawled across the rows of connected seats, some using jackets as blankets, others just staring blankly at the departure screens that flickered with delayed statuses. The air smelled of stale coffee, cleaning fluid, and that distinct metallic tang of recycled air that always clings to long hallways. Moving through this crowd was a man who looked as tired as the building felt. He was dressed in clothes that had seen better days. A dark, faded hoodie, a pair of jeans that were fraying slightly at the cuffs, and scuffed boots. He had a small backpack slung over one shoulder, the only bag he seemed to be carrying. He wasn't walking with the purposeful stride of a business traveler trying to close a deal, nor was he walking with the excited bounce of someone heading off on vacation. He was just walking, head slightly lowered, trying to make himself as small as possible. If you looked closely, you might recognize his face. He was a movie star, one of the most famous actors in the world. But tonight, with his hair unstyled and a cap tucked into his pocket, he didn't look like a celebrity. He looked like a dad who had been working a double shift or a student coming home from a long semester. He moved through the concourse with a practiced invisibility, looking at the floor, keeping his hands in his pockets. He didn't want to be seen. He just wanted to get to where he was going without causing a scene. He stopped near a large glass window that looked out onto the tarmac. Outside, the ground crews were loading luggage onto a cart, their yellow vests flashing in the darkness. He watched them for a moment, letting out a long, slow breath. It was a kind of breath that comes from deep in the chest, the kind you let out when you've been holding in stress for hours and just need to let it go. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the tightness that had settled there. It was rare for him to have a moment like this, completely alone in a sea of strangers, where nobody was asking for a selfie or an autograph. It was a quiet kind of peace, even if it was exhausted. A few minutes later, the announcement crackled over the speakers. It was distorted and hard to understand, but the gate agent nearby confirmed that boarding was about to begin for his flight. The people around him started to shuffle, gathering their coats and checking their phones. He stood up, adjusted his backpack, and got in line. He didn't try to cut ahead or push his way to the front. He waited his turn, standing near the back of the group. He watched an older couple in front of him struggling to find their boarding passes on their phone, and he patiently waited, not sighing or checking his watch, just giving them the space they needed. When it was finally his turn, he handed his pass to the agent. She didn't look up at first, too busy scanning the barcode. When she glanced up and handed back, her eyes widened just a fraction. She paused, her mouth opening slightly. He looked at her, offered a small, tired smile, and gave a quick nod of his head. It was a signal, a silent request to just keep things normal. She understood. She smiled back, a genuine warm smile, and handed him the pass without making a scene. "Have a good flight," she said softly. "Thank you," he replied. His voice was quiet, rough around the edges like he hadn't used it much today. He walked down the long, enclosed jetway. The floor vibrated slightly under his boots from the engines of plane waiting at the end. The air grew cooler as he approached the aircraft door. The flight attendant standing at the entrance greeted everyone with a bright, practiced voice, but she, too, did a double take when he stepped inside. She kept her composure, but her eyes lingered on him for a second longer than usual. He nodded to her as well, that same polite nod he gave everyone, and stepped into the cabin. The inside of the plane was cozy and cramped. The overhead bins were already mostly full, and the aisle was narrow. He had to turn his shoulders sideways to squeeze past a man who was already trying to stuff a large coat into a compartment. He moved slowly, careful not to bump into anyone or step on toes. He was in the back of the plane, in the economy section, far away from the extra legroom of the front rows. He didn't mind. He actually preferred it back here. It felt less structured, more real. As he made his way toward his seat, a woman was standing in the aisle, trying to balance a baby on her hip while digging through a bag for a pacifier. She was blocking the way, looking flustered and stressed. The line of passengers behind her was growing impatient. Someone let out a loud huff. He stopped and waited, giving her space. She looked up, startled, realizing she was holding everyone up. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice tight with panic. "It's okay," he said immediately. His tone was so gentle, so lacking in judgment, that it seemed to calm her down. "Take your time. No rush." He smiled, a crinkly-eyed smile that reached his whole face. She let out a breath, found the pacifier, and stepped aside. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded again and kept moving. Finally, he reached his row. It was near the very back, right next to the small galley where the flight attendants prepared the drinks. He was in a window seat. He took off his backpack and held it, waiting for the person in the aisle seat to move, so he could get in. The seat next to him was empty for the moment, which was a small stroke of luck. He maneuvered his way into the row, squeezing his tall frame into the tight space between the seats. Once he was seated, a sense of relief washed over him. He placed his backpack under the seat in front of him and leaned back. The seat was firm, the fabric slightly scratchy against his neck, but it felt good to be off his feet. He looked out the small oval window. It was pitch black outside, save for the blinking red lights of the wingtips and the steady stream of headlights moving along the service road below. There was no rain, just clear, cold air and the distant hum of the ground. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of simple headphones. He wasn't looking at a script or checking emails on a fancy tablet. He just sat there, one leg bouncing slightly with nervous energy, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He looked out at the darkness, his face unreadable. To anyone watching, he was just another anonymous traveler, a man in a hoodie trying to get through a long night. He closed his eyes for a moment, the hum of the plane systems rising up around him, and for a second he looked entirely at peace, unaware of the rude interaction that was waiting just around the corner. The peaceful bubble in the back of the plane didn't last very long. The steady rhythm of passengers finding their seats was interrupted by a sharp, jarring noise that cut through the low murmur of the cabin. It was the sound of a voice that was used to commanding rooms, a voice that was currently raised in anger. A man was marching down the aisle, moving with a speed that made him bump into the shoulders of anyone who wasn't quick enough to pull their elbows in. He was wearing a tailored suit that looked expensive, the kind of fabric that doesn't wrinkle easily, paired with a crisp white shirt that was already straining at the buttons. He held a phone to his ear, his face flushed red, shouting into the receiver about numbers and deadlines and someone named David who had apparently messed everything up. He stopped abruptly at the row where the quiet traveler in the hoodie was sitting. The man in the suit looked at his boarding pass, looked at the row number, and let out a loud, frustrated groan. He was clearly annoyed that he wasn't sitting in first class, or at least in the bulkhead, where he could stretch his legs. He ended his call with a harsh, "Dear job," or "Don't bother coming in tomorrow," and shoved his phone into his pocket. Without looking at the person in the window seat, the man in the suit grabbed the handle of his large, heavy briefcase. He tried to jam it into the overhead bin directly above their heads. He didn't lift it carefully. He shoved it with force. The bin was already crowded with other bags, and the briefcase didn't fit. He grunted and pushed harder, his jaw clenched tight. The bin door rattled, threatening to pop open. Suddenly, the bag slipped from his grip. It tumbled out of the compartment and plummeted downward. The corner of the hard briefcase slammed into the shoulder of the man in the hoodie. It was a solid impact, the kind that makes you wince just seeing it. The briefcase then bounced off the armrest and landed with a heavy thud on the floor. The man in the hoodie flinched, his body jerking sideways from the blow. He raised one hand to his shoulder, rubbing the spot where the sharp metal corner had dug into his muscle. It was obviously going to leave a bruise. He didn't cry out, though. He just closed his eyes for a second, absorbing the pain, and then looked up. The man in the suit didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't ask if the other man was okay. Instead, he glared down at him, his eyes narrowing with pure irritation. He looked at the seated man, as if he were an inanimate object that had deliberately gotten in the way. "Great," the man in the suit snapped, kicking his briefcase slightly to the side. "Just great. Now I have to deal with this mess because you're sitting there." The man in the hoodie looked at the briefcase on the floor, then back up at the angry stranger. He withdrew his hand from his shoulder and offered a small, awkward smile. It was the kind of smile you give when you want to fuse a situation, even when you're the one who got hurt. "It's okay," the seated man said softly. His voice was rough but calm. "These bins are tricky. Do you want a hand with it?" The offer of help seemed to make the man in the suit even angrier. He bristled, his back stiffening. He took a step closer, invading the personal space of the row. He looked down his nose at the faded jeans and the worn-out hoodie. He saw a man who looked like he didn't have a care in the world, and it infuriated him. He was stressed, he was rich, and he was important, and here was this nobody trying to be nice to him. "I don't need your hand," the man in the suit sneered. He raised his voice, causing a few people in the rows in front of him to turn around. "I need you to move your bag so I can fit mine. Why is your stuff even up there? Don't you know how to travel?" The seated man blinked, confused. He hadn't put anything in the overhead bin yet. His small backpack was still tucked safely under the seat in front of him. "I think that might be someone else's bag," he said gently, gesturing to the cluttered bin. "I don't care whose bag it is," the man in the suit shouted. He reached up and started yanking bags out roughly, tossing a jacket and a small tote bag onto the adjacent seats, not caring who they belonged to. Just make room. Honestly, flying with the general public is a nightmare. You people have no consideration for anyone else. He finally managed to force his briefcase into bin and slammed the door shut with a loud bang that echoed through the cabin. Then he dropped heavily into the aisle seat next to the window passenger. He immediately spread his knees wide, taking up as much space as possible, and threw his elbows onto the armrests, effectively boxing the other man in. The seated man shifted his legs, pressing his knees against the plastic wall of the plane to give the angry man more room. He tried to make himself smaller, shrinking into his corner of the seat. He just wanted to disappear again. But the man next to him wouldn't let it go. The plane was beginning to taxi now, the engines roaring to life as the vehicle pushed back from the gate. The flight attendants were beginning their safety demonstration, but the man in the suit wasn't watching. He was sitting with his arms crossed, huffing loudly every few seconds. He stared straight ahead, then suddenly turned his head to look at his seatmate with a look of pure disgust. "You smell," the man in the suit said abruptly. It wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, loud accusation. The man in the hoodie stiffened slightly. He raised his arm and sniffed his sleeve self-consciously. He had been traveling all day, but he didn't think he smelled bad. Still, the comment was humiliating. "I'm sorry," the seated man murmured. "I've been traveling since this morning." "Well, it's unpleasant," the suit snapped. "And look at your clothes. You look like a mess. Can't you afford something decent to wear? Or are you one of those people who just doesn't care about their appearance?" The insult hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Around them, the atmosphere in the back of the plane shifted. The passengers who had been dozing off or reading magazines were now wide awake. People in a row across the aisle exchanged uncomfortable glances. A teenager a few rows back pulled his headphones down, his mouth open in shock. It was rare to see such unprovoked aggression in public, especially toward someone who was being so quiet. "Do you even have a job?" the man in the suit continued, his voice dripping with condescension. He was leaning in now, enjoying the sound of his own voice. "You look like a bum. People like you are a drain on society. Just sitting there, taking up space, looking useless. I bet I pay more in taxes in a week than you make in a year." It was a barrage of words designed to hurt and demean. The man in the hoodie sat there and took it. He didn't fight back. He didn't yell. He just sat with his hands folded in his lap, looking out the window at the dark runway lights rushing by. His face was calm, but there was a sadness in his eyes now. He seemed to look right through the angry man, seeing the pain and insecurity that was causing the outburst, rather than hearing the specific words being said. The man in the suit waited for a reaction. He wanted to fight. He wanted the other man to yell back, to get angry, so he could feel justified in his cruelty. But when no retaliation came, the man just looked more annoyed. He huffed again, pulled out his phone, and aggressively tapped the screen, muttering under his breath about losers and waste of space. The tension in the cabin was tight enough to snap. The air felt thick and suffocating. The flight attendant walked by, pushing the beverage cart, but she slowed down as she passed a row. She looked at the angry man, then at the quiet man in the hoodie. She saw the red mark on the quiet man's shoulder where the bag had hit him. She opened her mouth to say something, to tell the man in the suit to settle down, but the quiet man caught her eye. He gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't," his eyes said. "It's okay." The flight attendant hesitated, then moved on, but she kept glancing back over her shoulder, worried. The plane lifted off the ground, climbing into the night sky, leaving the city lights below. In the darkness of the cabin, illuminated only by the soft glow of reading lights, the rude man continued to fume, and the kind man sat in silence, bearing the weight of the stranger's anger with a grace that was starting to draw the attention of everyone around them. The plane had leveled out at cruising altitude, and the fastened seatbelt sign had dinged off. Most passengers settled in, adjusting their pillows or reaching for books, but the peace in row 24 was completely shattered. The man in the suit, seemingly unsatisfied that he had caused enough trouble, decided he wasn't done. He shifted in his seat, his movements jerky and aggressive, constantly knocking his elbow into the arm of the man in the hoodie. Every time their arms touched, the suit would pull away quickly and wipe his sleeve with a look of disgust, as if the other man's clothes were contagious. The man in the hoodie tried to accommodate him, pressing his shoulders so hard against the plastic wall of the aircraft that he was practically sitting halfway out of his seat. But the more space he gave, the more the man in the suit seemed to want to take. "You're doing that on purpose." The suit snapped suddenly, breaking the silence that had settled for only a few minutes. The man in the hoodie turned his head slowly, looking confused. "Doing what?" he asked, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the hum of the engines. Leaning into me, "Invading my space," the suit accused, his voice rising. "I paid good money for this seat, and I can't even sit comfortably because you're sprawling all over the place. Do you have any concept of personal boundaries? Or is that too much for your brain to handle?" It was an absurd accusation, considering the man in the hoodie was practically folded in half to avoid touching him. But logic wasn't what was driving this interaction. The man in the suit was vibrating with a nervous, aggressive energy. He was looking for a target, a place to dump all his frustration, and he had found a willing victim who wouldn't fight back. "I'm sorry," the man in the hoodie said again. He truly seemed to mean it. He adjusted his position, turning his knees further away, creating a gap between them. "I'll try to stay on my side." The apology, instead of diffusing the situation, acted like gasoline on a fire. The man in the face turned red, his nostrils flaring. He hated the pity in that voice. He hated that this stranger was being nice when he wanted him to be angry. It made him feel small, and to fight that feeling, he decided to tear the other man down even further. "Stop saying you're sorry," the suit barked. Several people in the rows in front of them turned their heads to look. The mother with the baby a few rows back looked worried. "It's pathetic." "You're pathetic." A grown man apologizing for just existing. "Look at you." He gestured with an open hand, waving it up and down to indicate the man's entire body. "You're dressed like a slob. That hoodie looks like it's been worn for a week straight. Do you even own a mirror? Or an iron? I doubt it. You probably just roll out of bed and don't care what you look like because you have nowhere to be." The man in the hoodie didn't look down at his clothes. He didn't try to defend himself. He just sat there listening. His expression wasn't angry. It was attentive, almost as if he were hearing critique in a meeting, except there was a deep sadness in his eyes. "I have work," he said quietly. The man in the suit let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Work? Doing what?" "Flipping burgers? Scrubbing floors." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a loud, conspiratorial whisper that everyone could still hear. "Let me tell you something. People like you are a drain on society. You contribute nothing. You take up space. You breathe good air, and for what? So you can sit next to hard-working people like me and annoy us? You probably don't pay taxes. You probably live off the government." The insults were getting louder and more personal. The man in the suit was on a roll now, his stress from the day, his failed deal, and his general unhappiness pouring out at him in a toxic stream. He wasn't just talking about clothes anymore. He was attacking the man's character, his worth, and his life. "You have no ambition," the suit sneered, poking a finger toward the man's chest. "I can smell it on you. You're content with being mediocre. You're probably one of those people who thinks the world owes them a living. Well, Let me tell you, son, nobody owes you anything. You get what you earn, and clearly you haven't earned much. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to choke on. A man sitting across the aisle, a burly guy with a beard, clenched his fists tight. He looked like he was about to stand up and tell the suit to shut up, but his wife put a hand on his arm and shook her head. The flight attendant walking past stopped in the galley, pretending to organize napkins, but she was watching the scene unfold with her radio ready in her hand. Everyone was waiting for the explosion. They expected the man in the hoodie to finally snap. They expected him to yell back, to throw a punch, or at least to tell the guy to get lost. But he didn't. He sat there and took it. He looked at the man in the suit with a gaze that was so steady it was unnerving. He saw the sweat on the man's forehead. He saw the way the man's hands were shaking slightly as he gestured wildly. He saw the deep lines of stress etched into the man's face. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a human being who was suffering and was taken out on the person closest to him. "You seem very stressed," the man in the hoodie said softly. It wasn't a sarcastic comment. It was an observation made with genuine concern. The suit looked like he had been slapped in the face. He stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. He couldn't believe the audacity. "Stressed? Of course I'm stressed. I have important things to do. Not that you would understand what that feels like. You probably wake up at noon and sit on the couch all day." The man in the hoodie didn't argue. He didn't list his upcoming movies or his millions of dollars or the 14-hour days he worked on set. He just nodded slowly. "It is a heavy burden to carry," he said, his voice low and calming. "The stress, it weighs on you." "I don't need your psychological evaluation," the suit shot back, though his voice lost a fraction of its volume. He was unsettled by the lack of resistance. He was used to people fighting back or shrinking away in fear. This quiet acceptance was confusing him. It was holding a mirror up to his own behavior, and for a split second, he didn't like what he saw. But he pushed the feeling away and doubled down on his anger. "Just shut up," the suit muttered, turning his body away aggressively. "Don't talk to me. I don't want to hear your voice. You're worthless. You know that? Absolutely worthless." He pulled out his laptop again and opened it, but his hands were trembling so much he had trouble typing the password. He slammed his fingers against the keys, cursing under his breath. The man in the hoodie looked back out the window. The wing light flashed rhythmically against the darkness. He rubbed his shoulder where the bag had hit him. It was throbbing a dull ache now. He could have caused a scene. He could have pulled down his mask and said, "Do you know who I am?" He could have humiliated the man in front of the entire plane. Every person sitting around them was silently begging him to do it. They were on his side, angry at the injustice of it all. But he just sat there, breathing slowly, keeping his heart rate down. He knew that anger would only feed the fire. He knew that this man wasn't really angry at him. He was angry at his life. The man in the suit was still grunting and huffing, making a show of being the busiest, most important man on the flight. But the air had shifted. The man in the hoodie's quiet refusal to engage in the battle was disarming the aggressor, slowly stripping away his power, leaving him with nothing but his own echoing cruelty. The passengers watched, holding their breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The man in the hoodie turned away from the window and looked at the side of the rude man's face. His eyes filled with a strange kind of pity. He took a breath, and it seemed like he was preparing to speak, not to fight, but to finally break the cycle. The man in the suit continued to type on his laptop, the sound of his fingers striking the keys creating a harsh, rhythmic clatter that cut through the low drone of the engines. But he wasn't actually working. He was opening and closing windows, typing a few words, deleting them, and then tapping the desk surface in frustration. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He was sweating despite the cool air conditioning, a small bead of perspiration running down his temple and soaking into the collar of his crisp white shirt. To anyone watching, he looked like a man who was losing control, not just his flight, but of his entire life. The man in the hoodie sat perfectly still. He had stopped looking out the window. Instead, he was watching his seatmate. He wasn't looking at him with judgment or anger. His gaze was soft, almost clinical, as if he were diagnosing an illness but didn't know the cure. He saw the way the suit's leg was bouncing uncontrollably, a nervous twitch the man couldn't stop. He saw the white-knuckle grip the man had on the edge of the laptop. He saw the fear buried underneath all the arrogance. This man wasn't just rude. He was terrified. Something in his world was falling apart, and he was lashing out at the nearest target because he didn't know how to hold himself together. The tension in the row was suffocating. The other passengers nearby were pretending not to listen, but every eye was darting sideways, stealing glances at the confrontation. The mother with the baby had stopped trying to soothe her child and was watching with wide, worried eyes. The bearded man across the aisle had turned his body fully in his seat, his jaw set, ready to intervene if the shouting started up again. The man in the suit let out a loud, exaggerated sigh and slammed the laptop shut. The noise made several people jump. He threw his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes, his face twisted in a scowl. "Useless," he muttered to the ceiling. "Absolute trash." He turned his head suddenly, locking eyes with the man in the hoodie. "What are you looking at?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're better than me because you're sitting there all quiet? You think you're some kind of saint? You're nothing. You're just a loser with nowhere to go." The air in the cabin seemed to stand still. This was the moment everyone was waiting for. This was the moment where the quiet man finally snapped. It is human nature to fight back when pushed this far. People expected him to yell, to stand up and shout, "I'm Keanu Reeves. I've done more movies than you've seen in your life." They wanted him to put this jerk in his place. But the man in the hoodie didn't move. He didn't stiffen. He didn't clench his fists. He just looked at the angry man, his face remaining perfectly calm. There was no defensiveness in him, only a deep, quiet pool of empathy. He saw that the insults weren't really about him. They were a cry for help from a drowning man. He took a slow breath and shifted his body slightly, turning just a fraction more toward the aggressor. He didn't raise his voice. In fact, he spoke softer than he had spoken before. He had to lean in a little bit to be heard over the engine noise, which forced the man in the suit to stop yelling and actually listen. "You seem to be carrying a really heavy load right now," the man in the hoodie said gently. The man in the suit opened his mouth to shout again, but the words got stuck in his throat. He blinked, confused. He wasn't used to this. He was used to people fighting back or running away. He wasn't used to someone acknowledging his pain. "It looks like it's weighing you down," the quiet man continued, his voice smooth and even, like a calm stream flowing over rocks. "Whatever is happening, whatever is making you so angry, I hope it resolves itself soon. Nobody should have to carry that much anger around. It's too heavy for one person." The silence that followed these words was absolute. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The quiet man didn't stop there. He looked the suit right in the eyes, his expression open and sincere. "You have a safe flight," he added, offering a small, genuine nod. "I hope you get some rest." It wasn't a sarcastic jab. It wasn't a clever comeback. It was a blessing. It was pure, unadulterated kindness offered to someone who had done nothing but spit venom in his face. It completely disarmed the situation. It was like trying to punch a cloud. There was nothing solid to hit, so you just ended up swinging at empty air. The man in the suit stared at him, his face frozen. For a second, he looked like he might still explode, that his rage was too big to be stopped by a few kind words. But as he looked into the calm eyes of the stranger, something inside him cracked. The adrenaline that had been fueling his anger suddenly ran out, leaving him exhausted. He saw his own reflection in the window next to him, a red-faced, sweating, shouting mess. And then he looked back at the man in the hoodie, who was sitting there in his worn-out clothes, looking peaceful despite the bruise forming on his shoulder and the insult still hanging in the air. The contrast between the two of them was stark. One man had everything money could buy, but was miserable. The other man had very little, but seemed to possess an unshakable peace. The suit's face turned a deep shade of crimson. The shame hit him like a physical blow. He looked away quickly, unable to hold that kind gaze any longer. He pulled his arms in close to his chest, suddenly feeling very small and very exposed. He wanted to say something, to apologize, or maybe make another joke to save face. But his voice was gone. He felt the eyes of the other passengers on him. But now they weren't looks of fear. They were looks of pity. He realized that he hadn't humiliated the man in the hoodie. He had humiliated himself. The man in the hoodie didn't gloat. He didn't smile with satisfaction. He simply turned his head and looked back out the window at the darkness of the night sky. He patted his knee softly, a self-soothing gesture, as if the interaction hadn't bothered him at all. Across the aisle, the bearded man let out a long breath he had been holding and shook his head in disbelief. He looked at his wife and mouthed a word. Wow. The flight attendant, who was watching from the galley, stopped pretending to clean. She just stood there, her hand over her heart, touched by the display of grace she had just witnessed. The mother with the baby smiled at the back of the quiet man's head, grateful that he had defused the situation without scaring her child further. The man in the suit sat in his seat, rigid and tense. He kept his laptop closed on his tray table. He didn't move for a long time. The anger had drained out of him, leaving a hollow, empty feeling behind. He sat there, staring at the seat back in front of him, wrestling with the unfamiliar feeling of being the bad guy in a story where he thought he was a hero. The quiet man next to him had won, not by fighting, but by refusing to be an enemy. And in that silence, at 30,000 feet, the rude man learned a lesson he wouldn't forget for a long time. The silence that settled over back of the plane was heavy, but it wasn't the same suffocating tension as before. It was a quiet lull, the kind that happens after a storm has passed and the air feels clean again. The man in the suit didn't say another word. He sat rigid in his seat, staring straight ahead at the plastic back of the chair in front of him. His laptop remained closed, his phone screen dark. It was as if the wind had been completely knocked out of his sails. Slowly, the realization began to ripple through the cabin. People started whispering to each other, leaning across the aisle to share what they had seen. A teenager a few rows back nudged his friend and pointed a phone camera, not to mock, but to capture the moment. The whispers grew. "Is that who I think it is?" someone murmured. "Yeah, that's the guy from the movies." The Matrix won. Recognition spread like a slow wave. Passengers in the front rows turned around in their seats, craning their necks to get a look at the quiet man in the hoodie. They looked from his face to the back of the rude man's head, piecing the story together. The contrast was shocking. Here was a man who had millions of dollars, who could fly on a private jet if he wanted to, sitting in economy, taking a hit from a stranger's bag, and absorbing insults with the patience of a saint. And next to him was a man who had all the outward symbols of success, the suit, the briefcase, the attitude, but who was clearly spiritually and emotionally bankrupt. The flight attendant who had watched the scene unfold walked down the aisle with a purpose. She stopped at their row and bent down low. She didn't look at the man in the suit at all. She focused entirely on the man in the window seat. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked, her voice full of warmth and respect. "A water? A pillow? Anything at all." The man in the hoodie looked up and smiled, that same gentle, crinkly smile. "I'm all right, thank you. Just some water would be nice, please." She returned quickly with a bottle, making sure it was placed carefully on his tray table. "Thank you for being you," she whispered so only he could hear. He just nodded, accepting the compliment without letting it go to his head. He unscrewed the cap and took a sip, then turned to the man next to him. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say, "Do you know who I am now?" Instead, he held the bottle out slightly, offering to the man who had just spent the last hour tearing him apart. "Water?" he asked simply. The man in the suit looked at the bottle, then at the man offering it. His face was a mask of conflict. For a second, it looked like he might refuse out of spite, but then his shoulders slumped. The arrogance drained away, leaving just a tired, embarrassed middle-aged man. He shook his head slowly. "No," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I'm fine." He couldn't look the actor in the eye. The shame was too great. He realized he had insulted a man who possessed more class in his little finger than the suit had in his entire body. He had tried to make himself feel big by making someone else feel small, and he had failed miserably. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing the initial descent. The lights in the cabin flickered on, waking up those who had managed to sleep. As the plane began its gradual drop toward the city lights below, the atmosphere in row 24 had completely transformed. The hostility was gone, replaced by a protective vibe. The other passengers nearby were no longer annoyed by the delay. They were witnesses to something special. They saw a masterclass in how to handle a bully, not with fists, but with grace. When the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the usual rush began. The sound of seatbelt clicking open echoed through the cabin like a symphony. Everyone stood up, grabbing their bags from the overhead bins. The man in the suit stood up as well. He retrieved his heavy briefcase, handling it with care this time. He looked down at his seatmate, who was still sitting, waiting for the aisle to clear. The suit hesitated. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then tried again. He started, his voice cracking slightly. I was out of line. The man in the hoodie looked up, waiting. I've had a terrible month, the suit continued, his eyes darting around nervously. I lost a big account. My wife is leaving me. I took it out on you. You didn't deserve that. The actor didn't gloat. He didn't make the man squirm. He just stood up, sliding his backpack over his shoulder. He looked the suit in the eye and gave a short, understanding nod. We all have bad days, he said softly. It happens. Let it go. It was forgiveness, given freely and instantly. The suit seemed to deflate, the last bit of tension leaving his body. He stepped back into the aisle and did something that surprised everyone watching. He cleared the way and gestured for the actor to go first. It was a small, clumsy gesture of apology, but it was genuine. The actor walked down the aisle, and this time he didn't keep his head down. He looked at the people he passed. Smiles greeted him. People whispered, "Good job," and "Thank you" as he moved by. A young girl sitting near the front reached out her hand for a high five, and he laughed and gave it to her. He wasn't a celebrity surrounded by bodyguards. He was a part of the human family, sharing a moment of connection with strangers. He stepped off the plane and into the jetway, walking toward the terminal. The man in the suit followed a few steps behind, walking slower, looking like a man who had just been given a second chance at life. Outside the arrival gate, the actor stopped for a moment. He didn't have a driver waiting. He didn't have a crowd of fans screaming his name. He just stood there, adjusting his bag, looking at the signs directing people to baggage claim and ride shares. He looked like anyone else, tired and ready to go home. The story of what happened on that flight didn't make the headlines that night. There were no press releases, no tweets about it. But for the 50 people sitting in the back of that plane, the memory would stick. They had seen the difference between power and strength. They saw that you don't need to be loud to be heard, and you don't need to fight back to win. As the actor walked out of the terminal and into the cool night air to find a cab, he disappeared into the city, just another face in the crowd. But the energy he left behind changed a few people that night. The man in the suit would go home and maybe treat his wife a little better. The flight attendant would go home with restored faith in people. And the passengers would tell the story for years to come. Not about the movie star, but about the quiet man who taught a bully how to be human, simply by being kind. And that was a victory worth more than any award.